not being given complete and accurate information.
The next witness is Tom Cannon. Tom's going to deal with the estuary in 213 and 214 and what may happen in 215.
Oh, there it is. I worked as a fisheries analyst for NIMS, the board, and the state water contractors in 1980 and 81 on problems with D1485. Then I worked for the Bureau and the state water contractors in 1986 on further attempts to revise D1485. Then again in 94-95 for the state water contractors on the 95 agreement. That led subsequently to the D1641 standards. And then again on the Bay Delta standards for USBR and CalFed from 96 to 2000. One of the anticipated problems was fishery protections in winter, December to March, after decades of focusing on the spring and summer. More water would have been transported south in winter when Chinook, steelhead, longfin, and delta smelt are dependent on the delta. We had serious concerns about the 4,500 outflow minimum, 65% exports for December and January. There were also concerns that albeit greater protections in February and March were adequate, especially the confusing language in footnote 10 that everybody knows about. This chart it shows this year's conditions so far. Those concerns are proven real, as can be seen in this chart, by the high exports under the high ECs this winter, especially in December, prompting CSBA's continuing recommendation for stronger winter standards. The 5 key recommendations shown in this slide we believe are adequate minimum standards to protect the fish and their Bay Delta habitat for winter months. These are reasonable. Under these recommended standards, higher exports would have been allowed only from mid-December to mid-January safe period shown on the chart. You can see the standards there in blue and in orange.
Now for the, again, I'm always trying to think of the people who are
Sure.
listening who haven't been doing this for 20, 30 years like
Right.
you have. So what, in layman's terms, what you're saying is you shouldn't be exporting during the winter months because that's when the little guys are there. Or what, to put it in fish terms.
The red line is the exports, and they go up to 10,000 in December. They should never have been above 1,500 except during that low spot in the blue line, which was mid-January or mid-December to mid-January.
And then you're talking about lines on a map. Talk to me in terms of fish.
All right, in terms of the fish, that's a long story, but the fish are safe when these 5 conditions are met on the chart. If you go above any of them, and you can see the first one alone is the EC at Collinsville, the X2 at Collinsville, that's one of the standards in footnote 10. It just happens to be or instead of and. So changing it to and would make the standard apply, and you can see that you couldn't have exported anything more than 1,500 until the middle of I can't see it there myself, the middle of December, where on the blue line you see 2640. That's when you could have started to export, and before that time they were already exporting 8,000 and 9,000. So that's when it's safe for the fish. And the reason is you don't want to be exporting when the low salinity zone is up by Antioch, because the water's going to come from Antioch, and the fish are in that low salinity zone, and the Daphne and everything else is in the low salinity zone. And this is a key period of the year when the low salinity zone productivity starts.
So you're dealing with the estuarine health issue that Tom mentioned at the
Yes.
beginning of the day.
Next chart. The state water contractors in their comments in the order we saw earlier used the longfin smelt distribution from the safe period I just talked about to justify the higher exports proposed in the TUCP for February and March. They state that the smelt larvae are downstream of the low salinity zone, when in fact they're generally confined to that zone inside the red line, as is the usual case. The temporary urgency change petition would move the low salinity zone upstream to the blue line, or thereabouts. The order had concluded that such a move would not be in the best interest of the smelt. The state water contractors state that that concern is unfounded. To show that the concern is not unfounded, I provide this distribution of longfin smelt for late January 2014, when we had lower outflows, and the smelt in the low salinity zone were further upstream and more vulnerable to exports. Board orders at that time kept exports at a minimum, as they should have been, given potential risks of higher exports pulling water and fish from the low salinity zone located in the West Delta. Using the existing safe conditions from last week's storm risks, under the existing safe conditions, the risks are low now and you could start exporting again. However, a return to low outflows, drought outflows during February, March would require export reductions per 1641 in the board's order. The proposed change, relaxation of export limitations under these conditions in this chart, which I predict are what's happening now, we just haven't been able to see it yet. Most of the fall, the risk to the fish and their low salinity habitat is great under these conditions on this chart, like they were last year. This is what's going on now. The low salinity zone and the outflows are consistent with this chart right now. Most of the fall and spring run Chinook will be rearing in the Delta in February and March. Hopefully the wild and hatchery winter run made it out during the recent storm, but it doesn't appear to be the case. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next witness will be Tim StrohShane for Restore the Delta.
Mr. StrohShane, I'm sorry, I mispronounced your name last week or yesterday or whenever it was. I got the emphasis wrong.
I'm Tim StrohShane. I'm a policy analyst with Restore the Delta. We incorporated into our own protest the extensive comments from our colleagues at CSPA, CWIN, and Aqua Alliance. On behalf of Restore the Delta, we extend our appreciation that the State Water Board chose in its order not to grant the intermediate flows requested in the temporary urgency change petition from DWR and the Bureau. The public interest in this matter concerns the protection of fish species, salinity control in the Delta, water supplies, and ecosystem conditions that prioritize a Bay Delta
Could you get closer to the microphone?
Oh, am I? Okay.
Yep, thanks.
That prioritize a Bay Delta estuary that it's on. It's green. It's not functioning. Oh. Is that better? Well,
We
that's much
worn
better.
another one out,
Ooh.
yeah.
Okay. Should I start over? Or I'll back up to the beginning of this paragraph. The public interest in this matter concerns the protection of fish species, salinity control in the Delta, water supplies, and ecosystem conditions that prioritize a Bay Delta estuary that continues to be fishable, swimmable, drinkable, and farmable in drought years as well as wet. Droughts are recurrent and predictable weather patterns in California. Droughts are not emergencies, except when our water agencies fail to manage for their recurrence. Current D1641 objectives give a green light to DWR and the Bureau to gamble that each water year will be normal to wet. They prioritize upstream storage for exports to south of Delta storage, resulting in a beggar thy neighbor competition, pitting against each other exports, salinity control, fish protection, and ecosystem protective outflows. Dry year south of Delta export demands put the board in the difficult role of a veritable God squad with immediate power over the Delta's endangered fish. This situation is preventable, and state and federal agencies have failed to prevent it. We urge the board to reconsider and void its relaxation of Delta outflow, Delta cross-channel, and San Joaquin River inflow objectives. Their relaxation does not best serve the public interest because both listed resident and migratory fishes using the Delta as habitat and migration corridors have been in decline for decades. Poor salmon and Delta smelt survival rates in the Delta have all occurred during the reign of D1641, even before the state entered the last 8.5 dry years. The board's order tightens the maelstrom engulfing these listed fish species as they face squarely the possibility of their extinction in the Delta watershed in 2015. We urge the State Water Board to reconsider its TUCP order post-haste to resume full effect of D1641 despite its shortcomings, except that state and federal export pumping should be limited to health and safety levels. And on that, today we heard many heart-wrenching stories of the real and desperate impacts of drought in the San Joaquin Valley and the Tulare Lake Basin. Restore the Delta recommends that the board, in reconsidering its TUCP order, specifically condition the order to target delivery of health and safety exports to communities you've heard from and heard about today, as well as other communities you've seen or heard in your own travels. We suggest you use your authority and stature to get water districts and their growers to give back to their communities by paying for delivering water to them. Finally, the board's order imposes a direct injury to Delta water right holders. The board has reallocated water rights of Delta users without due process and without extending equal protection to all. We urgently request that the board reconsider its order given this plain injury to the Delta's area of origin rights under the Delta Protection Act of 1959 and the Water Rights Priority System of the state of California. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. I have a question, but I think I'd like to wait for Mr. Jennings.
Mr. Jennings,
And I asked a bunch of questions, so please go ahead. You may answer my question. So we'll see.
I think Francis was probably the smart one here. I'll try to make this as painless and brief as possible. Does this work? Whoops. Okay. Whoops. Went too far. You know, in each of the last 2 years, we've told this board what would happen if you continue to relax Bay Delta standards or enforce. In that first year was enforce the standards, and after the fact, we told you what happened, and I think we in the summer of 2013 into 2014, we submitted, we did that, and as a consequence, I mean, you know, like for Delta smelt, I mean, you know, in 2013, they dropped 57% from the previous index fall midwater trawl. Last year, they dropped another 50%. And at some point, we're getting down to have to, well, anyway. Today, we're essentially telling you that if you adopt the TUCP as proposed, disaster is likely, and we may be facing, you may push species over the brink into a downward spiral. And when I'm talking to the resource agencies, I mean the fisher agencies privately, I say, okay, where's the limit? Where is the cutoff point, the point of no return for these fisheries? And they don't know. I mean, they're candid with me, except in private, they all say it's close. This is, well, in a way, it's the state board and the fishery agency's report card, because this is what happened to the pelagic fisheries. Salmoniid fisheries and the lower trophic levels mirror this, but since the state project began exporting water, began operation. And these are the numbers that either from 67 to 2014 or the 5-year average, but when they started operations to now. And we've lost, for some of these species, well over 99%. At what point can you not cease to compromise? How do you cut things in half when you're down to the last 1%? Drought's normal, although considering that Sac Valley and San Luis Reservoir contain something like 2.1 million acre feet, more water than it did last year. Sac Basin precipitation is 89% of average. The last time I was looking, LA lawns are green, and almond acreage is being expanded in the Central Valley. What is the justification for the TUCP or the order adopting the TUCP? You know how I feel about workshops. They're essentially an invitation to lie. Testimony presented in evidentiary setting, I guarantee you, would be very different from what you've heard today. As I go back to the long evidentiary proceedings of the past, it's fascinating that when you've got to testify under oath, when you're subject to cross-examination, when you will be rebutted, what is offered is very different than what you hear today. And a rigorous evidentiary proceeding, I think, is fundamental to any serious effort to get to the root cause and provide solutions. I mean, that's been consistent with, I've believed that for a long time. I mean, as I pointed in the slide, I mean, according to Monsanto, DDT is not a problem. According to Dow scientists, CFCs are not a problem. I mean, we can say anything, but when you put them in an evidentiary context, which is the equivalent of a rigorous peer review, context in the scientific world, truth is more likely to emerge. I've always felt that this was a manufactured crisis, and that export rights for water are surplus to the needs of the estuary in Northern California, senior water rights. I think, unfortunately, DWR and the Bureau overpromised deliveries. They hawked water like Goldman Sachs hawked securities. And a lot of people bought those promises. They didn't understand that the contracts were interruptible. And so they mortgaged their futures. They built their lives around the promise to water, and they're suffering. And I acknowledge that suffering. It's a real problem. And while compassion is called for, that won't solve the problem, because the solution is ultimately in balancing demand with actual water. And that is the mission of this board, while protecting the public trust. And lastly, what the board's creating its legacy. And this estuary is a national treasure. Fisheries that thrive for millennia are now threatened with extinction. It's a property right belonging to every Californian, to every person in the nation. A bond that we owe a debt to generations to come. And certainly the present standards, including the biological opinions, are not protective, as evidenced by the decline of fisheries over the last, few decades. You've already found that substantial increase in outflows are fundamentally necessary to protect the resource. We did that in 2010. We've not gone through a balancing, which is needed, but we know that more outflow is needed. And at this point, further relaxation of inadequate standards just simply it can't be justified. And that's why. And while I appreciate the effort that Tom put into it, his thought, and certainly picking up, as we had picked up, the fact that the fishery agencies did not address, unreasonableness. I think it also notable that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service talked about the MACE study, and which we provided a lot of comments to, and that clearly the prevailing opinion or attitude or science is no longer necessarily best available science. And so there is confusion. And when NEMS was talking about the uncertainties, now I don't understand how you can be uncertain and uncertain about the science and still do a concurrence that is protective of endangered species, hanging on the lip of extinction, but they managed to. But anyway, I guess that's all, and I'll shut up, and so maybe we all can go home after the next panel.
Well, there'll be a lot of public comment after that as well.
My condolences.
No, it's all helpful, and it's all valid. It's all valid.
Before we leave, I would like to take a couple of minutes to respond in terms of the legal equation here, because
just a couple, if you don't mind.
right, no
I'd let you all
problem.
go long.
We've tried everything here at the state board in my 30 years, except following the law. D-1641 is the law right now. There is no evidence that we've seen that would lead you to weaken it. The evidence is that it's too weak now. We should stop this and get on with trying to find protective measures for the Delta, for the ecosystem, for farming, for the urban areas. And to do that, we should go back to, we should consolidate phase 1 and phase 2, and we should get on with it. When we finish that, the drought will probably be over, but D-1641 anticipated droughts. And so those standards are the best place for you to stand on the law and the precedent and your predecessors. The remaining thing which we think would be important is that if you actually took D-990 and analyzed it, and you took D-1485 and you analyzed it, and you took D-1641 and you analyzed it, you would find that exports cannot legally happen under the circumstances we have today. It was not the original promise whereby the folks south of the Delta came north and built the facilities. The evidence on that is absolutely, it's in their own words. If you read Bulletin 76, 1 month after the State Water Project was approved, it says that the limit to exports in the Delta from the facilities we're building now and from our right to the two projects' rights to flows below the rivers or below the dams, you would find that they were absolutely right when they said the maximum amount the two projects can get is 3.1 million acre feet, and that it will decline based upon additional development within the Sacramento Valley and the Delta watershed, and that will drop it to 2.8 2.6 to 2.8. We're going to have to build facilities somewhere else to ever raise that number. And they laid out a dream of the Eel River, the Klamath River, the Russian River to go south. Ronald Reagan, for whatever reason, probably the only thing
You can wrap that.
yeah, Ronald Reagan decided that's not going to happen, not on my watch, and ended that possibility. So I guess what we're trying to get across is that D1641 it's shaky ground, but it's the only ground in this whole decision. Just let it go and work on the future. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a question, and at the risk of going even later. I understand the arguments about the need to update. That's what we're in the midst of doing. A lot of us have been distracted by dealing with the drought, but we really do have a drought. And we really do have a problem. So I can see saying, let's keep I'm talking about what Mr. Howard did approve, saying, okay, you've got to meet those flows. But the reality of the situation is if you meet those flows, you will be depleting storage to the extent that you may not be able to maintain salinity control or any cold water pool at all. You can argue that we were wrong last year, I'll just say use the royal we, in thinking that enough had been saved for that as well as everything else. And so it didn't work. I think that's a fair point, and I think Mr. Howard said that at the beginning. But if you empty the reservoirs, which is stored water, we're not talking about diversions, it's stored fair and square, you're guaranteeing that we're going to run out of temperature control later in the year. And I haven't heard any of you address that at all as a concern for fish. I'm not minimizing the concern. The part of our questions have been about the little guys that are there now. And I'm sorry if I use more colloquial language than many of you, but it's just more concrete for me, and I think a lot of the people listening.
Isn't there mandated carryover storage?
No. Yeah,
Okay.
The answer that I would give you, whether it's the one you're looking for or not.
I'm not looking for one. I am an open mind today.
The answer is you've got a lot more water than you had before. This time, you should take a hands-on approach to the way the Bureau uses it between now and oops.
I think that's what Mr. Howard was getting at. Okay, thanks. We better go to the next panel, and I also want to get to as many of the public comments as are still here. I think I have more cards than there are people in the audience, so I'll have a lot of apologies. All right, you asked to go last. I'm not going to ask you if you regret that decision.
No comment.
It made it more convenient than everybody asking to go before or right after lunch. So
We tried to accommodate. Yeah. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board, and the rest of the folks who have actually managed to stay here today. My name is Doug Obigi. I'm a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I want to pick up with the chairwoman's remarks. NRDC filed a protest of the original TUCP and objections to the executive director's order. We did not object to the waiver of the outflow requirements. We did not object to the waiver of the San Joaquin Vernalis inflow requirements, and we did not object to the waiver of the DCC gate closure requirements. We did, however, object and still object to the allowance of greater than 1,500 CFS exports when we are not meeting the outflow requirements of Decision 1641. And that includes not just the 7,100 CFS requirements of Table 3, but also the requirements of Table 4, which includes X2 days at chips, which we believe will probably be 30 days minus whatever carryover days are required. The reason why we took this position is because outflow is one of the dominant factors affecting the health of the estuary and its fish and wildlife. But we also recognize that if we were forced to release water from reservoirs, we could drain upstream storage. So our concern is is trying to strike that balance to maintain storage for cold water and for future human use in the estuary or throughout the service area, while also meeting as much as possible the outflow requirements of Decision 1641, which were adopted after a 5-year drought, after numerous days of hearings, and which includes specific provisions for flexibility in drought and dry years. I think you've heard a lot today about how bad off our fish and wildlife are at this stage. And I think you've also heard a lot about how bad communities throughout the state are suffering. And we're in a really bad shape. And I don't envy you at all. And I want to really extend my appreciation to the board and its staff for its careful consideration here. Striking a balance during these kinds of difficult times is not easy. However, I was really struck by the fact that the temporary urgency change petition that was filed proposes to worsen conditions for the estuary in spite of the numerous declines of fish and wildlife last year. And I think we do see that last year's operations had unreasonable effects on fish and wildlife. And it was not just a function of drought, but it's how we respond to drought. Secondly, I do want to speak for a moment about the board's standard and how it is different from the standard that the Fish and Wildlife agencies have to weigh under their Endangered Species Act. Your standard is supposed to be more protective. It includes things like meeting the salmon doubling requirements that are part of your water quality control plan. It includes protection of fall run Chinook salmon, the backbone of the state's salmon fishery, other fisheries, and looking at the long term. You know, if this drought does continue for 5 years, will what we're approving today really lead to extinction? I'll leave that for Dr. Rosenfield next to me, but I think it's all too easy to look in the crisis at the intermediate narrow issue and miss the forest for the trees. And I think you heard a little bit of that from the Fish and Wildlife Service, that they look only narrowly at individual change and they're not looking at the broader effects on the estuary and those long-term effects, whether they are greater invasions by invasive species, whether it is reduced abundance of food supply from upstream transport or other mechanisms. And you do have a requirement to do more than minimal ESA and CISA compliance. And I think that is difficult. When you asked for criteria, when Board Member Francis Spivey Weber asked for criteria, I would encourage you, as Carl mentioned, to look back at the testimony from the Fish and Wildlife agencies, not just in their flow criteria report and in that 2009 proceeding, but also what they've submitted to you more recently as part of the update of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. Because I think you will see that virtually every Fish and Wildlife agency and the independent reviews have agreed that the existing standards in Decision 1641 are not adequate to protect fish and wildlife.
Right.
And weakening those standards further really does jeopardize the health of the estuary and all the people and jobs that depend on it. Finally, going to the question of the public interest, I do believe that the public interest weighs against granting the TUCP and requiring that we meet that 11,200 CFS outflow requirement if we're going to pump more than 1,500 CFS. Storage and water supply allocations are better than last year. They're not great, and I don't mean to discount the fact that we are all suffering and it is a terrible drought, but we have at least 1.8, 1.9 million acre feet more in storage in Shasta, Oroville, Folsom, San Luis, and Trinity reservoirs than we did last year. That is better. The allocation for the State Water Project is at 15%, and according to their January 21st forecasts, under the dry conditions, the allocation will be 17 to 23%. Under wetter conditions, the allocation goes up to 27 to 39%. So obviously we know that as the year progresses, allocations can change. And obviously the allocations are not the only issue here. You know, part of the function of our water rights system is that it is seemingly inequitable, that some folks will get 75% or 100% of their allocations while others get zero. And I think you need to look not just at the communities and diverters who won't get water, but also look at those who do. Finally, you know, I do want to close by just mentioning that the board has a difficult job, and it affects not just what you do now, but how we deal with future years and how we deal with things like the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And it does make me very nervous when we move away from waiving standards. When we move away from the standards, that undermines that trust that any new facility would be operated responsibly. And I think that you need to consider that in your public interest balancing, because we are trying to make long-term solutions, and we are trying to make sure that we do protect all interests. So with that, NRDC urges the board to approve the executive director's order with respect to February and with respect to March require that outflow requirements of D1641 be met if exports are going to increase above minimum levels. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, the presentation, thank you. Thank you, board members, for really a marathon effort here. I need to click something. Oh, no, that was the wrong thing. Thanks for your patience, and I wanted to thank my colleagues also for carving out a few extra minutes of time here so I could go through it more. The TUC petition, as written, clearly increases the risk of extinction for several endangered species, and it clearly has unreasonable effects on fish and wildlife. The executive order correctly and wisely rejects the increased exports during low outflow periods, but to the extent that it still allows lower outflows, much lower than those called for by current hydrology, it maintains a high risk of extinction and unreasonable impacts to fish and wildlife. But I think that there is an opportunity here. We haven't really looked at the positive today very much, but current hydrology, as Doug mentioned, would trigger greater outflows under D1641 throughout March, and providing those levels of flow in D1641 levels of flow in February and March may be our last chance to reduce this extreme risk of extinction and to support fisheries that have been disproportionately harmed during the drought. It's an easy call for me to say that there's been unreasonable harm to our fisheries. I know that you're looking for clear answers on that, and so let me say it really clearly. The Delta smelt are their lowest index value on record. There are more people between you and me now than there were Delta smelt caught last year in the hundreds of surveys that were done to measure their abundance. Starry flounder is not a fish we hear very much about. It's a recreationally fished organism and an estuary-dependent organism. It was at its second lowest index value on record last year, and its decline from its maximum in the 1980 through 2014 period is 99.8%. There's been some suggestion in previous hearings from the state and federal water contractors agency in particular that longfin smelt, maybe if you look at different surveys, there isn't so much of a decline, or maybe the fish are just in a different place. Today I heard a different theory. I won't address it. It's sort of hard to keep up with the different theories of what's happening with longfin smelt. These are the three major surveys that are conducted in the estuary: the fall midwater trawl, the Bay Study midwater trawl, and the Bay Study otter trawl, and they're measures of longfin smelt through time. The fall midwater trawl shows a greater than 99.9% decline in longfin smelt. The Bay Study midwater trawl shows a 99.5% decline. The Bay Study otter trawl shows a 99.3% decline. If anyone tells you that this is not a species that's in serious risk of extinction, they're misinformed or they don't know what they're talking about.
Right, but nobody's said that. They've just said the question is whether the incremental change would be what would do it. We are in a drought, so
Right.
the fish are in bad shape.
Right.
Everybody's in bad shape, so the narrower question is,
Right. So it has been.
it's a narrower question than what's happened over time. We know
It-
we need to revise standards, and we know there's a lot to
Right.
it, including flow, but also including other things.
I appreciate that. It has been, the reason I raised it here is it has been suggested in previous hearings,
Speak.
previous processes, and I just wanted to clear that up because I don't see how we could question whether this species is endangered. And my larger point is that at this level, impacts to the fish, small though they may seem, are sort of missing the forest for the trees, to borrow Doug's phrase. This is a species that's greater than 99% decline over the past 35 years. So it's in deep trouble. As you know, and I won't belabor the point too much, many of the species, in particular the pelagic species in our ecosystem, show persistent, durable, high power flow abundance relationships. As more flow leaves the delta, their abundance tends to increase, again, on a logarithmic scale. This pointer doesn't work, but the y-axis is a logarithmic scale, so the 1 is, say, 10 fish, and the 2 is 100 fish, and the 3 is 1,000 fish. So these are really rapid responses to increases in flow, and that's what we're talking about here. In addition to the well understood or well known, I think now, flow abundance relationships, I wanted to point to a particular separate relationship with longfin smelt and outflow. This graph on the y-axis shows net delta outflow between February and June, and on the y-axis is salvage of longfin smelt. And you can see that most of the salvage is to the left, meaning almost all of the salvage occurs when delta outflows are low. And that's what we're proposing here, low delta outflows. And so increasing exports while we've reduced delta outflows seems to me to be a recipe for disaster. Here I've focused in on just that left-hand portion of the previous graphic just to give you more resolution of how rapidly salvage of longfin smelt increases when delta outflows are low. And so that's a real risk here to a population that's already, as I showed before, declined greater than 99.5%. But it's not just the pelagic species that are dependent on flow, and it's not just the pelagic species that are dependent on delta outflow. If delta outflows are reduced, the required delta outflows are reduced. Obviously, I mean, the point of that is to reduce reservoir releases or reduce flows in the river. And winter run Chinook salmon are fish that live in the river, and then they live in the delta, and then they live in the estuary. They depend upon flow all the way through that course. And they have declined only 86.8% since off their 1980 through 2014 highs, which were obviously much lower than their historical highs. So this shows the hydrograph from last year. The blue line is a very conservative estimate of unimpaired flow that would have appeared as delta outflow. The red line is actual delta outflow, and you can see the effect of our regulatory system and the TUC from last year in reducing those peak flows. Right, the red doesn't come anywhere near the blue line, and those peak flows, those pulses, are essential for, in particular, migrating salmon to orient and to move, to begin their migrations, and to orient towards which way is downstream. And we
It's interesting. You're the first person to actually talk about that, which I thought we'd be talking about all day long.
Yeah.
So.
You save the best for last.
Well, just the cues from nature,
Right.
it caused them to move. So storm flows are important for fish. It's not all extra water. When people think you can capture it all, it's very critical for them knowing when it's time to go. It's not just to scoot them out. It's
Exactly.
a signal because it's nature.
Right. I mean, this is what they've
Right.
evolved with, you know, and the mechanisms here, is it the physical movement of water? Is it the turbidity in the water? Is it the temperature of the water? Is it the fact that predators are not as effective when the flows are going by? It's probably all of those things, but the fact is that fish move on the flow, and what we're contemplating here, and I think people speak about it in a little bit of casual sense, is, oh, we're only taking the extra flow. It's a storm event. We can capture that flow before it's wasted to the sea. This is the essential time for the Chinook salmon. And in fact, the agencies identified this last year. This quote in green that I have up there in last year's temporary urgency change said in over and over again that the decrease in outflow standard would reduce winter run survival in the rivers, in the delta, and in the estuary. So a little bit more on that, since you like this
Well, thank you for
direction.
well, just thanks for addressing the question. People have talked about a lot of things today, all totally valid to say, but not many things have focused on the choices that are actually in front of us. I'm happy to hear all of it, including the venting, but
Right.
I mean, I'm here for you. But helping us make a decision is what I'm looking for.
Thank you. Well, my closing slides here will hopefully illustrate the questions that are before you now. So I wanted to point out in this that the red arrow represents winter run Chinook salmon eggs, spawning and laying of eggs upstream. And then those fish hatch, you know, after they're incubated, and they're in the river from July through March as juveniles, or as you say, little fish, right? And then as they grow a little bit bigger, they're in the delta, they're smolt. right? And they migrate out of the delta, or they migrate into the delta and then out of the delta between October and early April for winter run. From late April to early April, that's about 12 months, right? The fish require flows, different degrees of flow, different quality of flow, but they require flow throughout their fish, right? So
Fair point.
this is then to line up that sort of life cycle across multiple years, because this is where the choices you have to make really come into play. Fish that were spawned in 2013 are the red on the upper left there, right? And then they turn into juveniles, and by the time they get into the delta, it's 2014, okay? And that's just a little bit before the 2014 adults are returning to spawn, red, then they're juveniles, right? And now we're in 2015, and that middle blue era there is where we are right now. We have smolts in the delta, it's 2015, and we're just before the winter run for this year will go upstream to spawn. Last year, when the board and the agencies reduced delta outflows in this time of year, okay, that everybody acknowledged that cut against the smolts that had spawned that were deposited in the gravel in 2013.
Right.
Okay, and that was an impact. And the trade-off, the implicit trade-off, was we can't provide the outflows. We'll store the water upstream to protect the fish that are coming back to spawn in a few weeks and months in the 2014 year class. Okay, and that was a potentially reasonable trade-off to make. Perhaps we needed some more information before we made those decisions, but we now know what happened, which is that 95% of the 2014 wild winter run Chinook salmon died before reaching the delta. And just a little adjustment there. It's actually, that's up at Red Bluff. That's way before the delta, okay? So we're talking more than 95%, but I don't want to pick at details at this late hour.
That's right, because they still have to get from there.
They have to get to the delta, right?
Right.
So we made a trade-off. I appreciated Mr. Howard's comments this morning. It didn't work, right? We were all trying our best. But the problem is that in trying our best, we cut flows for the 2013 fish that were needing to migrate out, and we didn't achieve our goals for the 2014 fish. But now we're in a position of making the same choice. Will we cut flows for the remaining few fish that spawned in 2014, right, and are now in the delta, in a gambit to protect fish that may come back to spawn in 2015 and their eggs, okay? So my question would be, will the smolt of the 2014 spawning class meet the same fate as those in the 2013 spawning class? I mean, they're already hammered. We've already damaged 2 out of 3 year classes. And if we make that trade-off, what's the plan for protecting the 2015 spawning class throughout its life cycle? It's not enough to just, as we learned this year, not enough to just protect cold water for the eggs. The eggs become juveniles. The juveniles become smolt. This is sort of like, we don't want to be in a position of fully funding Head Start to the max by cutting K through 12 education, right? Those two things don't go well together.
Right. It's a combination of that and salinity control and everything else.
Sure.
It's not just that.
The final point that I want to make is that we often hear about a conflict between upstream protections and downstream protections. Should we protect the estuarine fish or should we protect the salmon, right? But that conflict only exists if you're thinking of salmon as only needing water when they're eggs. But as we know, we need flows when they're eggs, that's upstream. We need flows when they're juveniles and in the delta, and those are affected by our delta outflow regulations. And the salmon juveniles, the small guys that are in the river and then in the delta, are in the river in the delta at about the same time that the pelagic species need flow. So last year, in cutting delta outflow, we impacted the pelagic species and we impacted a previous year class of salmon in order to protect this year class of salmon. But it seems like, or it is, that this TUC is not intended to follow through on that trade-off that was made last year, but to remake it again this year.
Although that's part of the calculation that Mr. Howard made in not approving that last piece, was to protect that class of smolts.
Right, to protect
He did both. He approved part and not the other part.
this year.
This year.
Yes, correct.
Right.
And that was we appreciated that. But by reducing outflows, you're still having an impact on
Right.
the fish as they try and migrate.
Right.
So with that, the bell is rung, and
So what do you recommend then? Mr. Obiji said that the objection was related to the tiered exports. What
Sorry, sorry, Ms. Diadamo, that's NRDC's objection.
No, I realize that. That's
TBI
what-
has a separate protest.
Right,
objection, yeah.
so that's what I was just, I'm trying to follow, what would your recommendation be then on the TUCP?
Biologically, my recommendation is that having invested in the 2014 spawning class of winter run Chinook salmon and having already demolished the 2013 spawning class, we need to get those fish safely through the delta. And that is coincident with our need to protect pelagic species that are also suffering. The same water benefits
No, I
both of
understand
them.
what you're saying biologically. What are you recommending on outflow?
We're recommending the D1641 standards February and March.
No change. Okay.
Right, no